Let's go straight to our first guest for this segment, who is Jonathan Cohen, who's been the Executive Director of Conciliation Resources since 2016. He joined Conciliation Resources in 1997 and was awarded OBE in 2007 by the British government for his services to conflict prevention and conflict resolution in the Caucasus. Assalamu alaikum, peace be with you. A very warm welcome to The Breakfast Show.
Thank you ever so much. It's a delight to be with you.
Likewise. So let me start by asking you, can you tell us a little bit about Conciliation Resources? What is the mandate of your organization, and what have you been doing?
Yes, of course. So we're a charity, a non-governmental organization, and this is actually our 30th year. And for the past 3 decades, we've been working in a number of conflict regions around the world. And our mandate is to work alongside people who are enduring violent conflict and to try to support them to find ways to prevent and resolve those conflicts. And we work sometimes at a political level supporting formal negotiations. More often than not, we work with community actors to try and support them to influence the way in which those formal talks take place. And we also do quite a lot of analysis to understand the causes of conflict and to try and help people think through different strategies to transform their societies from situations of persistent violence and to try and create opportunities for more sustained and equitable development. And we do this working at the present time, working in about 15 or 20 countries around the world.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And how does Conciliation Resources approach peace building differently to maybe some traditional methods? What kind of adaptive and alternative methods do you use, and how do you approach this aim?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of approaches to ending conflicts focus on top-level political negotiations. And whilst it's really crucial to try and get ceasefires signed, to get peace agreements signed, our approach is that those are essential but never sufficient to bring about peace. And we're always looking at how do you bring in people who are excluded, people whose perspectives aren't listened to. And that means bringing in community actors. It means bringing in a whole range of perspectives, women's groups, different ethnic groups that are often marginalized, and recognizing that you need to bring on board armed actors who are fighting against, often fighting against the systems and the peace and against the powers that be. And so I think we believe in what we talk about as an inclusive peace process, not just an elite-centered approach to peace.
Mm-hmm. And can you give some examples of any successful initiatives that have demonstrated the organization's commitment to connecting people?
Yeah, so I think a couple of good examples of where this happens is what we've done in the Somali regional state of Ethiopia or in Mindanao in the southern Philippines. And both of these were long-running internal conflicts, civil wars, 20, 25 years in the case of the Somali regional state and 40 years in the case of the Philippines. And we, in the Somali regional state, we worked with some Kenyan politicians who acted as intermediaries between the Ogaden National Liberation Front and the government of Ethiopia. And it was a 6-year process of talks that led to the signing of a peace agreement in Asmara in 2018. And what we did was we provided technical support to the ONLF. We provided technical assistance to the Kenyan facilitators, but we also tried to work hard to bring in different perspectives. So we brought diaspora groups into the talks. We brought civil society actors in to bring their perspectives into the talks. In the Philippines, likewise, we were part of a process called the International Contact Group, which involved quite an unusual hybrid peace process. It involved 4 states, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, United Kingdom and Japan, and 4 NGOs, ourselves being one of them, working alongside Malaysian facilitators of peace talks between the government of the Philippines and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. And again, we were working hard to bring in the perspectives of indigenous people, to bring in the perspectives of women's groups, civil society actors, and there were something like 40 rounds of talks in that case. It was very different processes, because in the Ogaden there were very few direct talks. In the Philippines there were 40 rounds of talks. But I think that the point here is, how do you create an inclusive space in which different perspectives can be brought to the table, in which people can be challenged and feel comfortable to recognize what the other side needs in order to get to a peace process, and what can compromise look like? Because it's very rare that one side will get everything it wants. And what we're looking to do is work to bring fresh perspectives and ideas into the process and help people move from violence to politics as a way of solving their conflicts.
Mm-hmm. And how does your organization advocate for people-centered policies and international peace building? And what specific strategies are employed to prioritize people, in such policies?
Well, I think what's critical at the very beginning is to listen. All too often, people who are affected by violent conflict have a deep understanding of what's happening, but they have very few resources to actually engage and to act. And so we try to work alongside actors within their own community to do the analysis, to formulate strategies, and then to bring those perspectives to governments, intergovernmental organizations that have an ability to act. And there are different ways to do this. Sometimes it's really important to speak out, but we also sometimes talk about the need to speak in, to work together with governments to bring about change. And one really interesting example where we've done this has been with a group called the Tri-Sector Group, which has been a group of NGOs, banks and government. And in fact, the Muslim Charities Forum has been a really important partner in this. And it's been about trying to get policy to change, about transferring funds to situations where there are violent conflicts in order to be able to work with groups there and address some of the risks of banks being very averse to having bank accounts for charities, especially Muslim charities, in areas of violent conflict because of counter-terrorism regulations. And we've been quite successful in working with, through this Tri-Sector Group, to bring about some changes in approach and understanding of the nature of the problem. So sometimes it's really important to speak out and make a very loud public statement, but sometimes it's really important to do it through quiet diplomacy and building relationships, and through that bring about policy change.
Yes. And can I ask you what work you're doing, or what policies or strategies you are putting in place in terms of the Israel-Gaza conflict?
Well, we ourselves don't work in the Middle East. I think one of the challenges for any relatively small NGO like ourselves is you have to have the expertise to work somewhere. You have to be able to work long-term. And we believe in long-term accompaniment. Many of the places we've worked, Kashmir, the South Caucasus, these are situations where we've worked for 20, 30 years, and they are of long duration, and we have the expertise, we have the colleagues who can work there. And we don't have that in the Israel-Gaza situation. But I think what's really crucial in a situation like that is, how do you move from violence to political process? There's no question that the horrific things have been happening in the region, and there's an appalling toll of death. And yet it's a cycle of securitized responses to what needs to be seen as a political problem. And that sounds a bit dispassionate, to sort of step back from some of the appalling humanitarian crisis at the moment. And that needs to be addressed, and you need to end fighting. You need to create the space for the political process. But in fact, sometimes you have political processes happening in the background alongside fighting. I think of what happened in Colombia, where the fighting between the government and the FARC continued for many years, but they also had a political process at the same time. Very different situation, and one needs to be careful to make comparisons. But I think until we find the space to have a political solution, it's tragically, I fear there will be a persistent continuation of violence in the Middle East and in the Israel-Gaza situation in particular.
Thank you. And, we are talking about peace in 2024, not just political peace, which is in the usual understanding. In your opinion, when are you at peace? What's peace for you? Is it just that there's no wars, there's no fighting?
Well, I think people talk about different types of peace, negative peace, structural peace. I think clearly one has to start with an aspiration to bring wars and violent conflicts where there is armed engagement to an end. But I think we also have to recognize that if you're not addressing the root causes of conflict, if you're not looking at why communities, why people have aspirations that are confounded by the structures around them, that will lead to a persistent risk that violence will permeate through society. And I think we need to look at the structures of our societies, think about the inequalities, think about those grievances and how they can be addressed. And without doing that, there's a risk that peace can be ephemeral. And we're very fortunate in this country to live in relative peace. But I think we have to be conscious that we live in a very violent world. There are more people displaced today than has ever been the case. More than 100 million people are displaced and refugees, which is an extraordinary statistic. And we face multiple crises. We see the risk of climate change exacerbating violent conflict. We see questions of displacement and migration, which I think are only going to get worse as climate change escalates. So we really need to rethink how it is we invest in supporting peace building and the prevention of conflicts, to get away from a securitized approach that always sees military responses as a way to address conflict, and to think of more political approaches, and to think of approaches that address the deeper socio-economic problems that we observe.
Jonathan, in view of the thinking about the challenges that you've just listed, and I would fully agree that absolutely we are, I think, at a very critical juncture in terms of where we are in terms of the geopolitics of the world. Do you think the world at large is still living in oblivion and is oblivious to these challenges, especially the mainstream media?
Well, it depends what one calls the world at large. I mean, I think the reality is the world at large is the majority of people in the world who actually, an awful lot of them experience violent conflict. I think in the UK, yes, I think we are a little bit oblivious to some of the problems. And the UK population is a very generous population by and large. When there are charity appeals and for humanitarian disasters or earthquakes, it's extraordinary what people in this country do to provide money to support. The problem is we don't see enough money invested in things like preventing conflicts and building peace in advance of violence. We really struggle to raise money for what we do, and it's interesting what it costs to do our work. The peace process we supported in the Ogaden in the Somali regional states of Ethiopia over 6 years cost less than half the price of a tank, and that helped bring to an end a 25-year conflict. And I think the challenge, you mentioned the media, the challenge of the media is it tends to, there's an old saying, if it bleeds, it leads. And the challenge of the media is it very often sensationalizes or addresses violence as a story. It's much harder to tell the story of the more nuanced, long-term, patient endeavors that it takes to build peace. And I think we've got to get better at telling the story of how people who are affected by violent conflict can take those painstaking steps to build peace and support them, so that our wider society is prepared to commit to that kind of support. And we did a survey several years ago looking at people's attitude to supporting engaging with armed groups, for instance, and we found that there was real support for doing this, but it's finding better ways to tell the story so that you can translate that support into resources and greater political commitment.
And finally, Jonathan, can you tell us about your work in the Caucasus, for which you won the OBE?
Well, thank you. And that was a long time ago. So there are two conflicts in the Caucasus in the South Caucasus, where we've worked for a long time, and a conflict between Georgia and Abkhazia and the Armenian-Azerbaijan conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh. And your listeners might be aware of the fact that last autumn there was renewed hostilities in and around Nagorno-Karabakh, and Azerbaijan retook the territory that it had lost in a war in the early 90s. And that led to the displacement of more than 100,000 people. So it was a very difficult period. We've been working for a long time trying to bring people across the Georgian-Abkhaz divide and across the Armenian-Azerbaijani divide together, sometimes through dialogue processes with political and social actors. We've done a lot of work with the media, helping people make films about the situation. We've also been doing, and those are cross-conflict collaborations, which are really hard to navigate, but seem very courageous initiatives by local journalists. And we've also been trying to help people think through what can reconciliation mean. What is it about the historical memory that stops people finding a path to peace? And I think that's a real challenge, because one of the things we observe in conflicts around the world is the way in which people's interpretation of what has happened can be very jaundiced, and it can be very one-sided. And it's very difficult to recognize the aspirations of the other side as legitimate. You might not agree with them, but to have an aspiration for independence or for a different type of self-government, it's a legitimate aspiration. The question is, what are the processes through which those aspirations are pursued, and can they be pursued through political processes, or do they get pushed into the terrain of violence? And we've been working with people to try and create spaces where there can be political conversations across divides, and that gets very difficult when military responses, for instance, in Ukraine, the war there has created less space for discussion in the South Caucasus, because people get drawn into, are you with Russia, are you with the West? And that can reduce the space for more nuanced debates about how do you create a sort of mutually beneficial outcome.
Jonathan, such a pleasure to speak to you. Thank you so very much for your time, and all the best with all the excellent endeavors. Peace be with you.
Thank you ever so much. Bye-bye then.
Bye-bye.